I had been planning a solo camping trip for a while. The stress of work had been getting to me, and I needed to get away from everything for a few days. I picked a spot deep in the woods, far from any towns, roads, or other campers. It was a place I had been to once before, years ago, but back then, I had been with a group of friends. This time, I was alone. I drove out early in the morning, making the long trip out of town and into the wilderness. The deeper I went, the thinner the road became. Eventually, it was just dirt and gravel winding through dense trees. I kept driving until I reached a spot where the road faded into a rough trail. Then I parked my truck and got out. The air was fresh, the sky was overcast, and the forest was quiet except for the sound of the wind moving through the trees. It was exactly what I had been looking for. I grabbed my backpack and supplies, locked up the truck, and started hiking. The hike took a little over an hour. The deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. It was a strange feeling at first, but after a while, I started to enjoy it. There was something peaceful about being out there with no one else around. Eventually, I found a good spot, a small clearing near a creek, surrounded by thick trees. It was perfect. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and got everything ready before the sun started going down. As the light faded, the air turned cold. I got a fire going, cooked some food, and sat back, enjoying the quiet. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustling of the trees in the wind. Then I started to notice something strange. Every now and then, I would hear a noise, something moving in the distance. At first, I ignored it, thinking it was just a deer or some other animal. But as the night went on, I realized it wasn't just random movement. It was steady, deliberate. Something was circling my camp. I sat up, listening closely. The sounds were faint, but they were there. Footsteps, soft, careful steps moving through the brush. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the trees, but I couldn't see anything. The firelight only reached so far, and beyond that, everything was dark. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe it was nothing. I stayed up for a while, staring into the darkness, but eventually, I convinced myself to go to sleep. That was a mistake. I don't know how long I had been asleep when I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. Then I heard it, a sound just outside my tent. Slow, deliberate breathing. I froze. It was close, so close that I could hear the way it inhaled, then let the air out in a slow, steady way, like it was testing the air. I stayed completely still, trying not to make a sound. My heart was pounding so hard I was afraid it would give me away. Then I heard it move, not walking, crawling. I could hear the slow shift of its weight against the dirt, the way the leaves crunched softly under its hands, or whatever it was using to move. It stopped right beside my tent. I could feel its presence just on the other side of the thin fabric. And then, slowly, it pressed against the tent. I stopped breathing. I could see the shape of it just barely, a human outline, but something was wrong. The proportions were off. The arms were too long. The head was tilted at an unnatural angle. Then it spoke. My own voice. It was perfect. The same tone, the same rhythm, like I was hearing myself through a recording. But there was something wrong with it, something off. It was like it was too perfect, like it had practiced over and over again until it got it just right. It whispered my name. I didn't move. I didn't respond. I just stayed there, frozen, waiting. After a few moments, it moved again. The pressure against the tent disappeared, and I heard it crawling away. I stayed awake until morning. As soon as the sun came up, I packed my things as quickly as I could. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just grabbed my gear and started hiking back to my truck. The entire way back, I felt like I was being watched. The feeling never went away. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear into the back, jumped in, and locked the doors. I sat there for a second, catching my breath. Then, just as I was about to start the engine, I saw something in the trees. A figure, standing between the trees, just barely visible. It was tall, too tall, with long arms and a head that seemed wrong. Then it took a step forward. That was all it took. I turned the key, threw the truck into drive, and got the hell out of there. I didn't look back. I haven't been back to that forest since, and I never will. I never planned to camp in a graveyard. It wasn't one of those thrill-seeking ideas people get after watching too many horror movies. It just happened because I was careless and a little too sure of myself. It was late autumn, somewhere in the middle of nowhere in a small town I had never heard of before. I was on a solo camping trip, something I had done dozens of times. I loved the quiet, the isolation, the feeling of being far away from the rest of the world. That trip was supposed to be like any other. Find a spot, set up camp, enjoy the silence. But I had underestimated the drive. The road stretched longer than I expected, winding through miles of nothing but trees, abandoned barns, and empty fields. It was already past sunset when I realized I wouldn't make it to the campsite I originally planned on reaching. I didn't want to drive in the dark for too long, not on those twisting roads that barely had any signs. That's when I saw it. A clearing at the edge of the road, just beyond a rusted wire fence. I slowed down, squinting through the dim light. There were old, scattered headstones. A graveyard. I don't know why I thought it was a good idea. Maybe it was the exhaustion, the impatience to stop driving. Maybe I told myself it wasn't that strange. People camped in all kinds of places. What was the difference between sleeping in a forest full of dead trees and sleeping near some dead people?
I pulled over.
My truck's headlights washed over the uneven ground, revealing rows of tombstones, some standing straight, others leaning as if they had given up. Most of them looked old, names faded into the stone. There were no flowers, no signs that anyone had visited in a long time. The fence surrounding it was barely standing, rusted metal posts holding up sagging strands of wire. I hesitated, but only for a moment. I grabbed my gear from the truck, walked past the fence, and found a relatively flat patch of ground near the far end of the graveyard, away from the road. There was a large oak tree, its roots pushing up through the dirt. It wasn't the best spot, but it would do. I set up my tent quickly. The air was cold, and the wind had a bite to it. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and lit a small campfire with some dry branches I had brought with me. The flames flickered weakly, barely holding against the breeze. As I sat there, eating a protein bar and watching the fire struggle, I started noticing things. The quiet. It wasn't the normal kind of quiet I was used to in the woods. There were no animal sounds, no crickets, no owls, nothing. Just the wind moving through the trees and the distant rustling of dry leaves. The smell. It wasn't overwhelming, but there was a damp, earthy scent mixed with something faintly sour, like rotting wood or something else. And then there were the graves. I kept catching myself glancing at them, feeling like they were too close, like I had intruded on something I shouldn't have. I shook off the feeling. I was being stupid. I finished my food, put out the fire, and crawled into my tent. I slept lightly. Every small noise pulled me halfway to the surface of wakefulness. The wind, the creak of branches, the rustling of dry grass. Then something new, a soft, steady crunching sound, like footsteps. I forced myself to stay still, listening. The sound was slow, moving through the graveyard, careful. It wasn't an animal. The steps were too deliberate, too controlled. I held my breath. The sound stopped. Minutes passed. I stayed frozen, my body tense, ears straining. Nothing. I slowly let out the breath I had been holding. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was just the wind shifting the leaves. but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there. I didn't sleep much after that. When morning finally came, the pale sunlight creeping through the thin fabric of my tent, I was already awake. I unzipped the entrance and stepped outside, stretching stiff muscles. The air was still cold, but the unease from the night before had faded in the light of day. I kicked dirt over the remnants of my fire, packed up my gear, and turned back toward the road. Then I stopped. There were footprints, deep, clear prints in the damp soil, leading around my tent. Not mine. I stared at them for a long time. They came from the direction of the graves, circled my tent once, then vanished back toward the tombstones. I felt a chill crawl up my back. I had locked my truck. There was no sign that anyone had touched it. Nothing was stolen. No tracks leading to the road, only to my tent and back. I forced myself to move to get to my truck and drive. As I pulled away, I glanced one last time at the graveyard in my rearview mirror. The headstones stood silent, the trees motionless. But I knew I hadn't been alone that night. I never went back to find out who or what had been out there with me, and I never camped near a graveyard again. It was late October when I decided to go on a solo camping trip. The days were getting shorter, the air colder, and I wanted to spend one last weekend outdoors before winter set in. I had been camping all my life, mostly with my father when I was younger, and later on my own. I enjoyed the quiet, the escape from city noise, and the way the forest felt separate from the rest of the world. I chose a spot deep in the woods, about 2 hours from town. The area wasn't well known. No marked trails, no maintained campsites, just a dirt road that eventually narrowed into something only a high-clearance truck could handle. I had found the place years ago on a hunting trip and remembered it for its seclusion. A small clearing sat beside a stream, surrounded by thick pines and a few ancient oaks. The place was perfect. The weather forecast had warned of possible rain, but I didn't think much of it. I packed a tarp, an extra set of dry clothes, and plenty of firewood. The drive out was uneventful, just long stretches of empty road cutting through fields before turning into dense forest. By the time I reached the dirt road leading to my spot, the sun was already starting to dip behind the trees. I parked my truck a little off the path and started unloading my gear. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, and the only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant calls of birds. It was peaceful. I set up my tent close to the tree line, making sure it was far enough from the stream in case the rain got heavy. After that, I gathered some rocks to make a fire ring, laid out my firewood, and took a few moments to just take in the silence. By the time the fire was going, the sky had turned dark. Clouds covered the stars, and the wind had picked up slightly. I sat by the fire, eating a simple meal of canned beans and bread, enjoying the warmth against the growing chill. I had brought a small battery-powered lantern, but I preferred the firelight. There was something about sitting in the dark, watching the flames, that made me feel at ease. Then the rain started. At first, it was a light drizzle, barely more than a mist in the air. I pulled my tarp over my gear and made sure my tent was zipped up tight. The fire hissed as drops hit the embers, but it held strong. I sat for a while longer, listening to the rain tapping against the leaves. It was relaxing, but as the minutes passed, the drizzle turned into steady rain, and soon after, it became a downpour. The fire began to struggle, and I knew it wouldn't last much longer. I put out what remained, not wanting to risk embers catching on wet wood. Then, I climbed into my tent, making sure everything was secured. The sound of the rain drumming against the fabric was loud, but it was nothing I hadn't dealt with before. I lay there for a long time listening. There wasn't much else to do. The forest, usually alive with sounds, had gone almost completely silent. No insects, no birds, nothing. Just the rain and wind. I tried not to think too much about it. Sometimes animals hunker down in bad weather, I told myself. Sometime later, I started drifting off, but a noise jolted me awake. It wasn't the wind or rain, it was something else. A dull, rhythmic thudding. I held my breath, listening. Thud, thud, thud. It was distant, but not too far. Sounded heavy, solid, like something hitting wood. I sat up, careful not to make noise. The tent was small, just enough room for my sleeping bag and gear, so I didn't have much space to move. The rain masked a lot of sounds, but this was distinct. A slow, deliberate impact, spaced apart. I reached for my flashlight but hesitated. I didn't want to shine a light and give away my position. Instead, I waited, hoping it would stop. Thud, thud. Then it did stop. I strained my ears, listening to the rain. I couldn't hear anything else. No movement.
No voices.
Just rain. I told myself it was probably a tree branch falling, maybe hitting another tree on the way down. It had to be. The logical side of me wanted to believe that, but my instincts were telling me something else. I stayed awake, unmoving, for what felt like an hour. The rain kept falling, and nothing else happened. Eventually, exhaustion won over paranoia, and I let myself lie back down. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to something much closer. A sharp, deliberate crack, like a stick breaking underfoot, right outside my tent. My body froze. The sound had come from just a few feet away. Not the wind, not the rain. Someone was out there. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. The rain had softened to a steady drizzle, making it easier to hear. I strained my ears, listening for any movement. Then, there it was, a faint shuffling sound, slow, careful. I felt my heart pounding in my chest. Who else would be out here in the middle of nowhere, in the rain, in the dark? There were no nearby trails, no campsites. No one should have been anywhere near me. I reached for the knife I kept near my sleeping bag, gripping it tightly. I had my truck, but it was a good 30 yards away, and I'd have to unzip the tent, get out, and run. Then, another noise. Not footsteps this time. Breathing. Heavy just outside the tent wall. I could hear it over the rain. Slow, deep breaths, like someone standing right there, just inches away from the thin layer of fabric separating me from whatever was out there. I clenched my knife tighter, every muscle in my body locked. The breathing continued for what felt like forever. Then slowly it faded. I listened as the footsteps moved away, slow and deliberate, until they disappeared into the sound of the rain. I didn't move. I didn't dare make a sound. I don't know how long I stayed like that, gripping my knife, listening to nothing but my own heartbeat. Eventually, the exhaustion caught up to me, and I must have drifted in and out of a restless sleep. By the time morning came, the rain had stopped. Light filtered through the tent, and I forced myself to move. My body was stiff from staying in one position for so long. I unzipped the tent carefully, knife still in my hand, and stepped out. The forest was quiet again, but something felt off. Then I saw them. Footprints. Deep human footprints circling my tent. Not boot prints. Bare feet. I packed up my camp in record time, barely stopping to eat. I didn't even bother checking the area. I just wanted to leave. The drive back felt longer than usual, every shadow along the road making me uneasy. By the time I got home, I told myself I had imagined some of it. Maybe it was just an animal. Maybe the footprints had been distorted by the rain. But deep down, I knew better. Someone had been out there with me in the middle of nowhere, watching, waiting, and I still don't know why. I never liked camping alone. but sometimes life forces you into situations you'd rather avoid. It was late September, and the air had that sharp bite that let you know summer was truly gone. The days were getting shorter, and by the time I reached my campsite, the sun had already started dipping below the trees. I had planned this trip as a way to clear my head. No distractions, no people, just me and the quiet of the woods. The spot I chose was deep in the forest, about 2 miles from the main road. I had parked my truck in a small clearing and hiked in with my gear. The forest was dense, the trees towering overhead, their thick canopies blocking out most of the evening light. It was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no rustling in the bushes. Just the occasional gust of wind whispering through the branches. I set up camp near a small clearing, close to a fallen tree that I planned to use as a makeshift bench. My tent was simple, just big enough for one person, and my sleeping bag was thick enough to keep out the cold. I started a fire, using some dry wood I had gathered on my way in, and cooked a quick meal. The food tasted bland, but I didn't care. I was tired, and all I wanted was to relax. As the sun disappeared completely, the forest became a different place. Shadows stretched between the trees, and the fire's glow barely pushed back the darkness. The quiet became heavier, more noticeable. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I wasn't used to being alone in the woods like this, but something felt off. I shook it off and focused on keeping the fire going. There was something comforting about the crackling flames, the warmth pushing back against the night. I sat there for a while, staring into the fire, trying to enjoy the peace I had come out here to find. Then I heard it, a sound, faint but unmistakable, coming from deeper in the woods. It wasn't an animal, at least not one I recognized. It was slow, deliberate, almost like footsteps, but they weren't steady. They would move a few paces, then stop, then move again. I held my breath, listening. The sound was coming closer. I told myself it was just the forest settling, maybe a deer moving through the trees, but something about the way it moved, so hesitant, so deliberate, made my skin crawl. I reached for my flashlight and shined it into the darkness, sweeping it across the trees. Nothing. I exhaled, telling myself I was being paranoid. The mind plays tricks on you when you're alone in the dark. I turned back to the fire, poking at it with a stick to keep my hands busy. Then I heard it again, closer this time. I shot up, my heart pounding. The sound was just beyond the fire's glow, in the trees. I shined my light again, but all I saw were branches and leaves. No movement, no sign of anything unusual. But I knew something was out there. I wasn't gonna sit around and wait to find out what it was. I grabbed my hatchet, the only weapon I had, and stood near the fire, keeping my back to the flames so I could see everything in front of me. The sound stopped. Silence. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something. A shape, a figure standing between the trees. I whipped my light toward it, but as soon as the beam hit, it was gone, vanished into the shadows. I wasn't imagining it. Someone was out there, watching me. I didn't move. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. Running wasn't an option. I'd have to go through the woods in the dark, and I had no idea what was out there. Staying put wasn't much better. I decided to act like I hadn't seen anything. Maybe whoever it was would think I wasn't aware of them. I sat back down, keeping my hatchet close, and forced myself to stare at the fire. But my ears were locked onto the forest, listening for any sound, any movement. Minutes passed, then an hour. Nothing. The fire started to die down, and I knew I had to make a choice. If I let it go out, I'd be sitting in total darkness. If I moved to get more wood, I'd be exposing myself. I chose the fire. I grabbed a few logs from my small pile and tossed them on, stirring the embers to bring back the flames. The light grew, pushing back the shadows, and that's when I saw it. Footprints, not mine. fresh ones in the dirt just beyond the edge of my camp. They hadn't been there before. Someone had been walking around my camp while I was sitting there. Watching me, I gripped my hatchet tighter. My mind was screaming at me to run, but my body wouldn't move. I scanned the trees, the shadows, looking for any sign of movement. Then, just beyond the fire's glow, I saw them. Two glints of light reflecting back at me from the darkness. They didn't move, didn't blink, just stared. I stood, my breath caught in my throat. The fire crackled, the wood popping, but everything else was silent. The eyes stayed locked onto me, then slowly they disappeared. I didn't hear footsteps, no sound of movement, just gone. I couldn't stay here. I knew that now. I packed up as fast as I could, shoving everything into my bag without care. My hands were shaking, my heart hammering so hard I thought I might pass out. I didn't care about the fire. I left it burning and started moving. My flashlight was in one hand, my hatchet in the other. I kept my light low, sweeping it back and forth, checking every shadow, every tree. The hike back to my truck was the longest of my life. Every few minutes, I would stop and listen. Sometimes, I thought I heard something, branches snapping, leaves rustling, but I never saw anything. By the time I reached my truck, my hands were so slick with sweat I could barely grip my keys. I fumbled them into the lock, yanked the door open, and threw myself inside. I didn't look back. I started the engine, slammed it into gear, and drove. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the main road with streetlights glowing in the distance. Only then did I let myself breathe. I never went back to that spot. I never camped alone again. And to this day, I still don't know who or what was out there with me. But I know one thing for sure. I wasn't alone that night, and whoever it was, they didn't want me to leave. I don't know why I chose that spot to camp. Maybe it was the quiet, the distance from other people, or the fact that I wanted to be alone. I was in my early 30s at the time, traveling through France with my tent and a backpack, trying to escape the noise of the city. I had no real destination, just a map and a rough idea of where I wanted to go. I had spent most of my time camping in forests, avoiding campgrounds, and sticking to the isolated places where no one else would be. This spot was somewhere in the south of France, a few miles off a narrow road that twisted through the countryside. I had been hiking for most of the day, and by late afternoon, I found a clearing that seemed perfect. The trees were dense enough to block the wind, and there was a small stream nearby. The ground was soft, no rocks or uneven patches, just grass and dirt. It was quiet, the only sounds coming from birds in the trees and the occasional rustling of branches as the wind passed through them. I set up my tent and got a small fire going before it got dark. I had some dried food with me, nothing fancy, just enough to keep me going. The air smelled of damp earth, pine, and the smoke from my fire. I sat there for a while, staring into the flames, feeling the warmth on my face as the cold started to creep in. The sun had disappeared behind the trees, and the sky had turned dark blue when I heard the first noise. It was faint, distant, barely more than a whisper through the trees. It could have been anything. A small animal, the wind shifting the branches, but something about it made me uneasy. I turned my head, listening. Silence. I shrugged it off and went back to my food, telling myself it was nothing. But then I heard it again. This time it was closer, a snap like a twig breaking underfoot. I felt my stomach tighten. I slowly turned my head toward the direction of the sound, scanning the darkness between the trees. The fire's light didn't reach far, but I could see just enough to know there was no one there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stayed completely still, listening. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. I waited, staring into the darkness, but nothing moved. I told myself it was an animal, a deer maybe, or a fox, nothing dangerous, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I reached for my knife, just in case, and kept it close as I finished eating. The fire crackled. The wind moved through the branches, but the forest around me was too quiet. I stayed awake for a while, staring into the flames, my ears straining for any sound, but I heard nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself I was being paranoid. I told myself it was just the isolation, the darkness playing tricks on my mind. I put out the fire, climbed into my tent, and zipped it up. The moment I lay down, I felt the weight of exhaustion settle over me. My body ached from the long day of walking, and despite my unease, my eyes grew heavy. I don't know how long I slept. I woke up suddenly, my body stiff, my breath shallow. Something had woken me. I stayed completely still, my ears straining. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Close. The sound of someone stepping on the soft earth just outside my tent. My stomach twisted. I didn't move. I held my breath. The footsteps stopped. Silence. Then, a sound that sent ice through my veins. Breathing. Low. Just outside the thin layer of fabric separating me from the night. I gripped my knife so tightly my fingers ached. My heart was pounding, but I didn't move. The breathing continued. Slow. Controlled. Whoever it was, they weren't moving. They were just standing there. I wanted to turn on my flashlight, but I was afraid. Afraid of what I might see. Afraid of what would happen if I let them know I was awake. I lay there, every muscle locked, waiting. The breathing was steady. Too steady. It wasn't the sound of someone who had been walking through the forest. It was calm, measured, like they had been there for a while. Watching. I didn't know how long I lay there, listening. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. My body was screaming at me to move, to do something, but I didn't. And then the breathing stopped. I waited. Nothing. I counted the seconds in my head. 10, 20, 30. Still nothing. Then, after what felt like an eternity, I slowly reached for my flashlight. I flicked it on, aiming it at the tent wall. Nothing.
No shadow.
No movement. I exhaled, my breath shaking. I slowly unzipped the tent, inch by inch, my heart hammering in my chest. I pushed the flap open and shined the light outside. The forest was still. The trees stood motionless in the night. The ground was empty, but then I saw them. Footprints, deep in the dirt, leading from the trees, stopping just outside my tent. But there were no footprints leading away. Whoever had been standing there had not walked away. They had been there, listening, watching, and then they had disappeared. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in my tent, my knife in one hand, my flashlight in the other, waiting for the first light of dawn. The moment the sun broke through the trees, I packed up my tent and left. I didn't look back. I didn't stop walking until I reached the road. I never went back to that part of France, and I never camped alone again. I always liked camping alone. I didn't mind the quiet. I enjoyed the feeling of being out in the open, away from the noise of everyday life. I had done it many times before, so I knew how to prepare, how to handle being alone, and what to expect. I thought I had seen it all, until the trip I took in the summer of 2018. I was in Idaho, near the Salmon Chalice National Forest. The area was beautiful, with deep forests, tall mountains, and quiet rivers cutting through the land. I had been planning this trip for weeks. I wanted to get away for a while, just me, my gear, and the wilderness. I had picked a remote spot, far from the main roads, where I wouldn't see anyone else for miles. That was what I liked, real solitude. I packed everything I needed. My tent, a sleeping bag, plenty of food and water, a knife, a hatchet, and my rifle. I always brought a gun when I camped alone. Not because I expected trouble, but because it was better to be safe than sorry. Out here, you had to be prepared for anything, wild animals, accidents, or even people. I drove my truck as far as I could down an old logging road, then parked where the trail became too rough. From there, I hiked a few miles in until I found a good spot. A small clearing surrounded by thick trees, not too far from a stream. It was perfect. I set up my tent, built a fire, and settled in. The first night was peaceful. I sat by the fire, ate some canned food, and listened to the sounds of the forest. The wind moved through the trees, and I could hear the distant calls of birds and insects. It was the kind of silence I had been looking forward to. I slept well that night, with only the occasional sound of branches shifting in the wind waking me up. The second day, I explored the area. I followed the stream for a while, looking for animal tracks and just enjoying the quiet. I didn't see anyone, which didn't surprise me. This place was far enough off the beaten path that few people ever came out this way. That was part of why I had chosen it. That night, I started feeling uneasy. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just small things. The forest seemed quieter than it should be. There weren't as many sounds. No birds, no rustling from small animals moving in the underbrush. It was strange, but I told myself it was nothing. Sometimes the forest just got quiet for no reason. But as the night went on, I started to feel like I wasn't alone. I would glance up from the fire, expecting to see something standing at the edge of the clearing, but there was never anything there. Just trees, dark and thick, standing motionless in the night. My gut told me something wasn't right, but I couldn't explain why. I had camped alone so many times before. I had never felt this kind of unease. Then, around midnight, I heard something. It was a sound I knew well, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, not an animal. Animals don't walk like that. These were human footsteps, moving through the trees, stopping every so often, like whoever was out there was watching. I grabbed my rifle and turned off my lantern, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. I listened, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from, but it was hard to tell. The footsteps seemed to move around me, circling my campsite at a distance. I waited. I didn't call out. I didn't move. I just sat there in the dark, my rifle across my lap, listening. The footsteps stopped. For the next hour, I sat there, barely breathing, waiting to hear them again. But the only sound was the wind in the trees. Eventually, I convinced myself that whoever it was had moved on. Maybe it had been a lost hiker, someone who had seen my fire and gotten curious. Maybe they hadn't even realized I was there. I didn't sleep much that night. Every little noise had me on edge. The next morning, I checked the area around my campsite. I found footprints. Not boot prints, not hiking shoes, bare feet. Someone had been walking around my camp, barefoot, in the middle of the night. The tracks weren't old either. The dirt was still fresh, the edges of the prints sharp. I felt my stomach drop. I packed up my gear and moved campsites. I didn't want to leave just yet, but I wasn't staying there another night. I hiked a few miles deeper into the forest, found a new spot near a rocky outcrop, and set up camp again. I told myself I was just being careful, that it was probably nothing. But that night, the footsteps came back. I was sitting by the fire when I heard them, slow, careful, moving through the trees just outside the firelight. My skin went cold. They had found me again. I turned off my lantern, gripped my rifle, and listened. The footsteps circled me for what felt like hours, stopping and starting, never coming closer, never going too far away. I sat there, heart pounding, waiting. Then I heard breathing. It was close, just beyond the trees. Deep, slow, deliberate. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just sat there, staring into the darkness, waiting for something to happen. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped.
No footsteps. No breathing.
Nothing. I didn't sleep that night. At first light, I packed my gear and left. I didn't bother eating, didn't bother making sure everything was packed neatly. I just shoved everything into my backpack and started hiking back to my truck. The whole way I felt watched. Every now and then, I would hear something behind me. A rustle in the bushes, the snap of a twig. But every time I turned around, there was nothing there. I made it back to my truck, threw my gear into the bed, and got the hell out of there. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But I do know one thing, I was not alone in those woods. And whoever was out there, they wanted me to know it. I haven't gone camping alone since. I always liked being out in the wild. It was the quiet that pulled me in the most. There's something about sitting under the open sky, hearing the wind move through the trees, the rustling of leaves, the distant call of an animal. It made everything else in life feel small. That's why I went out that summer, camping alone in a place I had never been before. I had done plenty of solo trips in the past, but this one felt different. I had driven out to a remote spot in the mountains, miles from any paved roads, following an old logging trail until the path became too rough for my truck. From there, I hiked in, carrying only the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and my rifle. Not because I expected trouble, but because I had learned long ago that being prepared meant surviving. The spot I picked was perfect. A small clearing surrounded by thick pine trees, the ground soft with moss, a creek running just a short walk away. The air smelled clean, fresh, untouched. I set up my tent, gathered some wood for a fire, and settled in as the sun started to sink behind the mountains. The first night was uneventful. I sat by the fire, ate a simple meal, listened to the sounds of the forest. The sky was so dark that the stars looked close enough to touch. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet that makes you forget about the rest of the world. But that peace didn't last. The second day, I spent most of my time exploring. I hiked up a ridge, got a good look at the land around me. There were no signs of anyone else, no footprints, no old campsites, nothing. Just endless trees stretching out in every direction. That was exactly what I had wanted. But when I got back to camp that evening, something felt off. It wasn't anything obvious. Nothing had been moved. My tent was still zipped up, my gear untouched. But the air felt different, heavier, like the forest was holding its breath. I brushed it off, told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I had been out here alone long enough to know that sometimes your brain starts to fill in the silence with things that aren't there. That night, I barely slept. It wasn't that I was scared. At least that's what I told myself. But every little sound outside my tent seemed louder than it should have been. The crack of a branch, the rustling of leaves, footsteps. I kept my rifle close, listening, waiting. Nothing came. When morning finally broke, I got up, stretched, shook off the uneasy feeling. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just an animal passing through, that I had spent too much time alone. I should have left that morning, packed up my gear, hiked back to my truck, gone home. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed. I forced myself to go about my day as if nothing was wrong. I fished in the creek, cooked over the fire, kept my mind busy. But every time I looked at the tree line, I had this feeling, like something was watching me. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I sat by the fire, rifle in my lap, listening. The forest was too quiet. No wind, no night animals, nothing. Just silence, thick and unnatural. Then, just past midnight, I heard it. A slow, steady crunching of footsteps. Not an animal, not a deer, not a bear. Person, moving just beyond the light of the fire, circling. I gripped my rifle, strained my eyes, but saw nothing, just trees and darkness. The footsteps stopped. I waited. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Then finally the forest exhaled. The wind picked up again. The night sounds returned. Whatever had been out there was gone, or so I thought. At first light, I made the decision to leave. I packed up my gear, stomped out the fire, slung my rifle over my shoulder, and started hiking back to my truck. The whole way I felt it, that same heavy presence, watching, following. I picked up my pace, moving fast, pushing through the underbrush, heart pounding. And then I saw it. A boot print. Fresh. Too fresh. Not mine. Someone had been out here. Close. Too close. I didn't stop to think. I ran. Branches tore at my arms. My pack bounced against my back. My boots pounded against the dirt. I could hear something behind me, something moving fast, keeping pace. My truck was just ahead, parked at the edge of the trail. I fumbled for my keys, breath coming in gasps. That's when I heard it. A voice. Low. Close. A single word. Wait. I didn't. I yanked open the door, threw myself inside, locked it. A shadow moved at the tree line, a figure just out of reach. I turned the key. The engine roared to life. The figure didn't move. I slammed my foot on the gas. The tires spun. The truck lurched forward, bouncing over the rough road, trees whipping past. My hands were shaking. My mind was racing. When I finally hit the main road, I didn't stop. I drove straight home, heart hammering the whole way. I never went back. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted, and I don't want to. I had always loved camping. Not the kind where you park an RV at a crowded campground with a store nearby selling marshmallows and overpriced firewood. I'm talking about real camping, the kind where you carry everything you need on your back and walk miles into the wilderness. The kind where there are no bathrooms, no cell service, and no one around for miles. That was exactly what I was looking for when I planned a solo trip to the forests of Montana in the summer of 2016. I had done plenty of solo trips before, so I wasn't worried. I had my gear, my food, and my bear spray. I had checked the weather, studied the terrain, and let my brother know where I was going. Everything was set. I drove for hours until the roads turned to dirt, then parked my truck near the base of the mountains and started hiking. The first few miles were peaceful, just the sound of my boots crunching on the dry pine needles and the distant calls of birds. The air smelled fresh, a mix of pine and damp earth. By mid-afternoon, I had covered about 8 miles and found a perfect spot to set up camp. It was a small clearing near a slow-moving river, far from any trails. I dropped my pack, set up my tent, and gathered some wood for a fire. As the sun set, I cooked a simple meal, just some instant noodles and beef jerky. The fire crackled, sending up a column of smoke that drifted lazily into the trees. I leaned back against a log, feeling completely at peace. But then, as the last of the daylight faded, I noticed something odd. Across the river, maybe 50 yards away, there was a man standing at the edge of the trees. I froze. He wasn't moving, just standing there, half hidden in the shadows. He had no gear, no backpack, nothing that suggested he was a hiker or a camper. He was just there. At first, I thought maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. The way the branches swayed in the wind, the flickering light of my fire, it was easy to imagine shapes that weren't really there. But as I stared, the figure remained. I told myself it wasn't anything to worry about. Maybe he was another camper, though I doubted it. Maybe a hunter. Maybe just some guy walking through the woods. Still, something about the way he was standing, so still, almost too still, made my skin crawl. I forced myself to ignore it. I wasn't going to let my imagination ruin my trip. I threw another log on the fire, climbed into my tent, and zipped it shut. That night, I barely slept. Every little sound outside had me on edge. The rustling of leaves, the hoot of an owl, the distant snap of a branch. I told myself it was just the normal sounds of the forest. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next morning, I woke up groggy but relieved that nothing had happened. The sun was shining, the river was glistening, and the eerie feeling from the night before almost felt silly. Almost. I packed a small bag with snacks and water and set out for a short hike. I didn't go far, maybe a mile upstream. I found a good spot to fish, caught a few trout, then headed back to camp to cook them for lunch. Everything seemed fine, but as I was cleaning up, I looked across the river again. The man was there. Same spot, same stillness. Only this time he was closer. Maybe 30 yards away now, still on the other side of the river, but definitely closer than before. My stomach turned. I tried to act like I didn't see him. If he wanted to come over, he'd have to cross the river, and the water was deep enough that I'd hear him splashing through it. But I kept my knife on me, just in case. Hours passed. The sun started sinking again. I kept an eye on the other side of the river, but eventually, I stopped seeing him. I started to relax, telling myself that whoever he was gone. But that night, as I lay in my tent, I heard footsteps. Not animal footsteps, human. They were slow, deliberate, just outside my tent. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it. I gripped my knife, barely breathing. The footsteps circled my tent, pausing every few steps. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just waited. Then, after what felt like hours, the footsteps faded. I lay awake until the first light of dawn. I had planned to stay out for a week, but that morning, I knew I was leaving. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, constantly glancing over my shoulder. My hands were shaking. My skin was clammy with sweat, even though the air was cool. As I started hiking back to my truck, I felt exposed. The trail was narrow, winding through thick trees, and every rustling branch made me flinch. I kept looking behind me, expecting to see him. The whole way back, I had that feeling like I was being watched. Then, about a mile from my truck, I saw something that made my blood turn to ice. On the trail ahead of me, right in the middle of the path, was a small pile of rocks. Not random, arranged, a marker. Someone had been there before me, and they wanted me to know it. I stepped around it and picked up my pace. My truck was just ahead, and I practically ran the last 100 yards. When I got to the truck, I threw my pack in the bed, jumped in, and locked the doors. My hands fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I tore down that dirt road faster than I ever had before. I didn't stop until I hit the highway miles away. I don't know who that man was. I don't know what he wanted, but I know he was real, and I know I wasn't imagining things. A week later, out of curiosity, I looked up missing person cases in the area. There were a few: hikers, campers, hunters, all gone without a trace. I haven't been back to that part of Montana since, and I never camp alone anymore, because sometimes the scariest things in the woods aren't bears or wolves. They're people. I had been camping alone for years. It wasn't about proving anything to myself. I just liked the quiet. I wasn't one for crowded campgrounds or guided hikes. I liked the kind of places where you could walk for miles without seeing another person. That's why I picked this valley. It was remote, deep in the wilderness, and I had only ever heard of a few people going out that way. The nearest town was a small place with a gas station, a diner, and maybe 100 residents, most of them retired. I had stopped there to fuel up and get some last-minute supplies. The old man at the gas station barely looked up from his newspaper when I asked if he'd heard of the valley. "Not many people go out there," he said, turning a page. That was exactly what I wanted to hear. It was late October, and the air was getting cold. I liked that. It kept the bugs away, and I wouldn't have to worry about other campers. The trees were almost bare, their twisted branches reaching up like skeleton fingers. The ground was covered in dead leaves, and the wind sent them skittering across the dirt like something alive. I parked my truck near a trailhead, packed up my gear, and started hiking. My pack was heavy, but I was used to it. I had everything I needed: a tent, sleeping bag, enough food for a few days, a knife, and my old rifle, just in case. I wasn't expecting trouble, but I always brought it on trips like this. You never know what kind of animals or people you might run into. The hike was hard. The trail wasn't maintained, and it was easy to lose it under the leaves. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No birds, no rustling in the bushes, just the wind. That should have felt peaceful, but it didn't. Took me most of the day to reach the valley. It was beautiful. Tall cliffs on both sides, a river running through the middle, and a dense tree line along the base. The ground was soft, perfect for setting up camp. I picked a spot near the water and pitched my tent, unpacking my gear and setting up a small fire. As the sun went down, the temperature dropped fast. I layered up, cooked some food, and sat by the fire, listening to the crackling wood. That's when I heard it, a sound from the trees. Not the wind, not an animal. Something moving. I froze, my body on edge. It was faint, just the sound of leaves shifting, like someone stepping carefully. I turned my head slowly, scanning the dark tree line. Nothing. I waited, my ears straining. Silence. I told myself it was just an animal. A deer, maybe. Something watching from a distance, curious about the fire. But the feeling didn't go away. I forced myself to eat, though I wasn't hungry anymore. I tried to relax, staring into the flames. The sound didn't come back. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I was just jumpy because I was alone in an unfamiliar place. I stayed up late, letting the fire burn low before finally crawling into my tent. I don't sleep easily in the woods, not even after all these years. I woke up a few times listening, waiting, but I didn't hear anything else. When morning came, everything seemed normal. The sun was bright, the air crisp. I shook off the unease from the night before, made some coffee, and spent the day exploring. I hiked up one of the cliffs, looking down at the valley below. From up there, my campsite looked tiny. The river cut through the land like a scar, winding through the trees and disappearing into the hills. There was no sign of anything unusual.
No footprints.
No broken branches. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That night, I built my fire bigger. I kept my rifle closer. And once again, I heard it. This time, it was closer. A slow, deliberate crunch of leaves. I didn't move. I held my breath, staring into the darkness. The fire crackled, sending flickering light into the trees, but I saw nothing. Then another step, closer. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward the sound. Nothing. The trees stood still. The ground was covered in leaves, undisturbed. I held the light there for a long time, waiting. My fingers tightened around my rifle. Nothing. I turned off the flashlight but kept the gun across my lap. I wasn't going to bed this time. I sat there for hours, staring into the dark. The fire burned down to embers, and I added more wood, watching the flames climb higher. No more sounds, no more movement. Eventually, exhaustion won. I didn't want to sleep, but my body did. I crawled into my tent, keeping my rifle beside me. I don't know how long I was asleep when I woke up to the sound of my tent zipper. Slow, deliberate. I stopped breathing. Something was outside, right there. I reached for my rifle, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would shake the tent. The zipper moved again. I pulled back the hammer of the gun. Silence. Long, suffocating silence. I waited, my finger hovering over the trigger. Then, footsteps. Slow, crunching footsteps moving away from the tent. I held still until the sound faded into the trees. Then I moved. I unzipped the tent fast, rifle raised. Nothing. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. The woods were still, but I wasn't alone. I packed up my gear in minutes. I didn't care about breakfast, didn't care about anything except getting the hell out of that valley. I shouldered my pack, rifle in hand, and started walking. I moved fast, barely stopping for breaks. The whole way back, I felt it, something watching me. Every so often, I would stop, turn, scan the trees. Nothing, but the feeling never went away. By the time I reached my truck, my legs were shaking. I threw my gear into the back, climbed in, locked the doors, and started the engine. I looked back toward the trail, and that's when I saw it. A figure, standing just at the tree line. Too far to see clearly, but close enough to know it was watching me. I didn't wait. I put the truck in gear and got the hell out of there. I don't know what was in that valley. I don't want to know, but I'll never go back. The rain had been falling steadily for hours, a constant patter against the thick canopy of trees above me. It wasn't a light drizzle, but a relentless downpour, soaking the earth and turning the narrow dirt road into deep, sticky mud. My boots were already caked in it, my jacket heavy with the weight of absorbed water, and my backpack pressing against my shoulders like a sack of bricks. I was deep in the woods, miles from any town, and camping alone. The plan was simple: 3 nights off-grid, just me, my tent, and nature. No distractions, no people, no schedules. Just silence and fresh air. The kind of quiet that lets you clear your head, reset from the world. That had been the plan, at least. But now, standing in the rain with my flashlight cutting through the misty darkness, something about this night felt wrong. I wasn't new to camping. I had done this plenty of times before, sometimes with friends, sometimes alone. I knew the rules: respect nature, prepare for the worst, always have an exit plan. But something about this trip felt different from the start. I had felt uneasy since I stepped out of my truck and into the woods earlier that day. It wasn't the weather. I had checked the forecast, packed accordingly. It wasn't the location. I had camped in remote areas before. It was something else. I had chosen a clearing next to a small creek, a spot that looked untouched. No signs of previous campers, no litter, no remnants of old campfires. It was perfect, at least at first glance. But as I set up my tent, I noticed strange details. The ground had been disturbed, not fresh, but enough for me to tell that something had been moved. Small patches of earth turned over, some rocks arranged in a way that didn't feel natural. I told myself it was just animals, maybe deer or raccoons digging around. I didn't think much of it at the time. By the time night fell, the rain had already started, light at first but quickly picking up. I sat under the tarp I had rigged up, eating a quick meal from a tin can, listening to the wind move through the trees. The forest was alive with sounds: branches creaking, water rushing over rocks, leaves rustling. Normal things. But then, somewhere in the distance, I heard something that wasn't normal. A sharp crack like a branch breaking under pressure. Then another, and another. I stopped eating, listening more closely. It wasn't the wind. It was rhythmic, deliberate. Something moving through the woods, breaking twigs underfoot. It was too steady to be an animal. Too slow, too careful. I clicked off my flashlight and let my eyes adjust to the dark. My heartbeat slowing as I forced myself to stay calm. I wasn't going to panic over noises. It was probably just a deer, maybe a stray dog, The rain could make everything sound worse than it was. But then the footsteps stopped. For minutes, maybe longer, there was nothing. No movement, no sound except the rain. I stared into the darkness, my ears straining for any sign of whatever had been there. Then, just as I started convincing myself I had imagined it, I heard something else. Closer this time, a rustling sound just beyond the tree line, the unmistakable sound of something brushing against wet leaves. It was faint, but there. I kept still, barely breathing. The fire had burned low, the embers casting a dim, flickering light. I reached for my knife, gripping it without thinking. I wasn't going to run. Not yet. Another sound, this time to my left. Closer. Something was circling my campsite. My body went cold, adrenaline flooding my veins. I wasn't alone out here. Someone or something was out there just beyond the trees, watching. I forced myself to move slowly, quietly, reaching for my flashlight. I turned it on and swept the beam across the trees. Nothing, just rain and darkness. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the perimeter of my campsite, but saw nothing out of place. But then, just as I was about to turn the flashlight off, something caught my eye. A shape, dark, unmoving, standing just beyond the reach of the light. At first, I thought it was a tree, but then I noticed the outline was wrong. Too narrow, too tall, and it wasn't swaying with the wind like the branches around it. I aimed the flashlight directly at it. Nothing. Whatever I had seen was gone. The rain picked up, hammering against my tarp, drowning out all other sounds. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the spot where the figure had been. My mind raced through every possibility. A trick of the light? My imagination? Or was someone really out there? I didn't wait to find out. Moving quickly, I grabbed my gear and threw it into my pack. I didn't bother breaking down my tent properly. I just collapsed it, stuffing it inside. I could get a new one later. Right now, I needed to leave. I slung the pack over my shoulders and turned toward the trail, my flashlight cutting through the downpour. The mud made every step slow and difficult. My boots sank deep, pulling at my legs, but I kept moving. I was maybe 100 yards from camp when I heard it again. A single, deliberate footstep, then another. Someone was following me. I didn't turn around. I didn't stop. I kept moving, pushing forward, focusing on nothing but the path ahead. My truck wasn't far, maybe a mile away. I could make it. I had to. But then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A figure, dark and tall, moving through the trees parallel to me, keeping pace. I moved faster, forcing my legs through the thick mud, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The rain blurred everything, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I ran. I didn't care about making noise anymore. I just needed to reach the truck. The path finally opened up, and I saw it, the faint reflection of my truck's headlights in the rain. I sprinted the last few steps, yanking the door open and throwing myself inside. My hands shook as I jammed the key into the ignition, my breath fogging up the windshield. The engine roared to life. I slammed the truck into reverse, tires spinning in the mud, and then I saw it, standing at the edge of the trees, tall, unmoving, watching me. Even through the rain, I could tell it wasn't just a shadow. It wasn't my imagination. It was real, and it had followed me all the way here. I didn't wait. I threw the truck into drive and tore down the road, mud spraying behind me. I didn't stop until I was miles away, until the forest was nothing but a distant blur in my rearview mirror. Even now, I don't know what I saw that night. I never went back, and I never will. It was early October when my boss, his mother, and I set out for the camping trip. We had been talking about it for a while, mostly at his insistence. He was the kind of guy who liked to mix work and personal life, and I guess I was just the kind of employee who went along with it. His mom was visiting from out of town, and he figured it would be nice for her to get some fresh air away from the city. I didn't have much going on that weekend, so I agreed. We drove up to a remote part of the country, somewhere deep in the forests of Oregon. The drive itself was long, maybe 4 or 5 hours from where we lived. As the roads got narrower and the cell signal started to fade, I started to feel a little uneasy. I'd gone camping before, but usually in places where other people were nearby, organized campgrounds, national parks with rangers. This was different. My boss had picked a spot off an old logging road, way off the beaten path. He said he used to come here years ago with his dad. When we finally got there, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees. The place was as remote as he had described. No signs of human activity, no campgrounds, no marked trails. Just miles of thick forest and a small clearing near a river where we set up camp. We pitched 2 tents, one for my boss and his mother and one for me. After that, we gathered firewood and got a fire going before it got too dark. His mom wasn't really the camping type, but she seemed happy enough sitting by the fire, wrapped in a blanket, sipping tea from a thermos. My boss and I cooked some food over the fire, simple stuff, sausages, beans, some bread. Felt like any normal camping trip. The first night passed without anything strange happening. It got cold, but we were prepared for that. The sound of the river nearby was actually kind of relaxing, and aside from the occasional snap of a branch in the distance, everything was quiet. It was the second day when things started to feel off. We spent most of the morning exploring. There was an old, overgrown trail leading up a ridge behind our campsite, and my boss suggested we hike up to get a better view. His mom stayed behind, saying the climb would be too much for her, so it was just the 2 of us, making our way up the slope. The deeper we went, the less the forest felt welcoming. The trees were old, towering high above us, blocking out a lot of the daylight. There was something strange about the silence. No birds, no wind rustling through the trees, just our footsteps on the damp ground. At one point, my boss stopped walking and looked around. "You feel that?" he asked. I did. The air felt different, heavy, like we had walked into a place we weren't supposed to be. A little further up, we found something unusual. A tree, stripped of its bark in long, deep scratches. The marks were too high up for any small animal to have made them, and too deep for a person with a knife. I ran my fingers over them. They were rough, fresh. My boss didn't say much about it. He just gave me a look and kept walking. We didn't stay up there much longer. The feeling of unease only got worse, so we turned back and made our way down to camp. His mom was still sitting by the fire, reading a book like nothing had happened. That night, I woke up to a noise outside my tent. First, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again. A slow, deliberate crunch of leaves. Something moving just beyond the firelight. I stayed completely still, listening. There it was again. Not footsteps exactly, but something shifting through the underbrush. My heart was pounding now. I reached for my flashlight and unzipped my tent as quietly as I could. The fire had burned low, just a few embers glowing in the pit. The forest beyond was nothing but darkness. Then a sound, closer this time. I swept my flashlight in the direction of the noise. For a second, I thought I saw movement, something low to the ground just at the edge of the trees. But as soon as the beam hit it, it was gone. I sat there for a long time, staring into the dark, listening. But the sound didn't come back. Eventually, I convinced myself it had just been an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, and went back inside my tent. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I didn't mention it to my boss or his mom. I figured there was no point in making a big deal out of something I wasn't even sure I saw. But then I noticed something. Near the fire pit, where the dirt was soft, there were marks. Tracks, but not like boot prints or animal tracks. They were odd, almost like handprints, but bigger, and spaced in a way that didn't make sense. I crouched down to look closer. My boss came over and saw them too. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at them. Then he muttered something about the ground shifting overnight and kicked dirt over them. That was the moment I knew he had seen something too. We stayed one more night. I don't know why we didn't just leave right then. Maybe we didn't want to seem paranoid. Maybe we were trying to convince ourselves nothing was wrong. That last night was the worst. The noises came back, but this time, they didn't stop at the edge of camp. I was lying in my tent when I heard the first crunch of footsteps. Then another, closer this time. I held my breath, gripping my flashlight, too afraid to turn it on. Something moved outside my tent. Not walking, crawling. I could hear the soft drag of something pulling itself through the dirt. I sat up, heart pounding. The fabric of my tent moved. Something brushed against it. Then, nothing. For the longest time, I didn't move, didn't breathe. Eventually, I heard it again, but this time, it was moving away, back toward the trees. The rest of the night was silent. I didn't sleep at all. At first light, I packed up my stuff. My boss and his mom did the same without a word about what had happened. None of us acknowledged it. We drove back in near silence. His mom made small talk, but my boss and I barely said a word. A week later, he quit his job and moved out of state. I never asked him why, but I think I already knew. I never went camping again after that. I had planned this trip for months. Just me, the woods, and a quiet weekend away from everything. I needed it. Work had been too much, life had been too much. So, I packed up my truck and drove 3 hours out of the city to a remote campsite in the middle of a national forest. It wasn't an official campsite, just a clearing deep in the woods that I had found a few years back while hiking. It was perfect. No other people, no noise, just the wind in the trees and the sounds of nature. I got there late in the afternoon, parked my truck on the dirt path about 20 feet from the clearing, and started setting up. I pitched my tent near the tree line, where the ground was flat and dry. A small stream ran a little ways down, so I wouldn't have to worry about water. I gathered some wood for a fire, enough to last me through the night, and cooked a simple meal on my little propane stove. The air was crisp but not too cold, the kind of weather where you needed a jacket but didn't have to shiver. By the time the sun set, I was sitting by the fire, staring into the flames, listening to the crackling wood and the distant sounds of the forest. Crickets, rustling leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl. The usual things. Felt good to be out here alone, away from everything. I let myself relax, watching the fire, feeling the warmth on my face. But then, sometime around midnight, I noticed something strange. The sounds of the forest had stopped.
No crickets.
No rustling leaves. No distant calls of animals. Just silence. At first, I thought maybe I was imagining it. Sometimes, when you focus too hard on something, everything else seems to fade. But this wasn't that. The air felt heavier, the woods around me darker. The fire crackled, but beyond that, there was nothing. I scanned the tree line, my eyes adjusting to the darkness beyond the fire's glow. The trees stood tall and still, their trunks like black pillars stretching into the night sky. I couldn't see anything unusual, but something felt wrong. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The silence was just nature shifting. Maybe a predator was nearby, and the smaller animals had gone quiet. It was normal, probably. Still, I felt uneasy. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it towards the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but more trees, the occasional bush, the uneven forest floor. No movement, no animals, nothing out of place. I swept it around one more time, then turned it off. I forced myself to relax, stirring the fire with a stick, adding another log. The flames flared up, casting flickering shadows along the ground. I kept telling myself there was nothing out there. Then I heard it, a sound, not from the trees in front of me, but from behind. A crunch like a footstep on dried leaves. Slow, deliberate. I turned sharply, flashlight in hand, aiming it towards the noise. The beam landed on my truck. The trees beyond it stood still, dark. My backpack was by the passenger side door, exactly where I left it. Nothing was there. I scanned the ground, looking for movement. I held my breath, listening. Silence. Then another crunch. Closer. I spun, shining the light towards the tree line again. Still nothing. At this point, my body had gone into full alert. Every hair on my arms was standing up. My breathing was slow, careful. My heart was pounding. Something was out there. I stood up, keeping the flashlight steady, and slowly backed towards my tent. My knife was inside along with my rifle. I hadn't thought I'd need it, but right now I wanted it close. Another crunch. This time it was right near my truck. I swung the light back toward it, my pulse hammering in my ears. And that's when I saw it. The figure, standing just at the edge of the trees, partially hidden behind the trunk of a pine. I couldn't see a face, just the outline of a person. Motionless, watching. I froze. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then slowly they stepped back. Not away, just deeper into the darkness, where the flashlight couldn't reach. Gone. I stayed there for what felt like forever, my breath caught in my throat. I waited, listening, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, rifle in my lap, staring into the woods. Every so often, I thought I heard something. A faint crunch, a shift in the underbrush, but I never saw anything else. By the time the sun rose, I had made up my mind. I wasn't staying another night. I packed up fast, stuffing my tent and gear into the truck without bothering to be neat. I didn't even eat. I just wanted to leave. The drive back felt longer than usual. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something behind me. I didn't relax until I was back on the main road, miles away from those woods. I still don't know who or what was out there that night. Maybe it was just some other camper, lost or curious. Maybe it was something worse. I haven't been back since. I don't go camping anymore. I used to. It was something I did all the time when I was younger. I grew up in a small town in Montana, and the outdoors was just part of life. My dad took me out into the woods before I even learned how to ride a bike. And by the time I was in my 20s, I felt more at home out there than I did anywhere else. There was something about being in the wild, away from people, away from noise, that made everything feel simpler. That all changed after one trip, one night. It was in the fall of 2016. I remember because the leaves had just started turning, and the air was getting colder at night. It was the perfect time to go camping. The bugs were mostly gone, the summer crowds had left, and the woods felt empty in a way that I liked. It wasn't my first time going alone, but it was the last. I had a spot I liked, about 2 hours from town, deep in the woods near an old logging road. Not many people went out that way, and that's what made it perfect. I packed light, a tent, sleeping bag, some food, my rifle. Just the basics. The drive out was easy, and by late afternoon, I had everything set up. The sun was going down, the sky turning orange, and the woods were quiet except for the sound of birds and the wind in the trees. That first evening was peaceful. I made a fire, cooked some food, and sat there watching the flames. Nothing felt wrong. Nothing felt off. But looking back, there was one thing that stuck out. Something I didn't think much of at the time. The forest was too quiet. Normally, there'd be owls, maybe coyotes howling in the distance. That night, there was nothing. Just the wind. I went to bed not long after the fire died down. My tent was small, just big enough for me and my gear, and I fell asleep fast. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but the fire was out, and the woods were dead silent. Not even the wind. I was groggy, still half asleep, when I heard it. Footsteps. Not an animal. Not something small moving through the brush. These were slow, heavy steps, coming from just outside my tent. I held my breath. My rifle was next to me, but I didn't move for it right away. I just listened. The steps were circling my tent. Slow, deliberate. Something was walking around me, just feet away. My heart was pounding so hard I thought whoever, or whatever, was out there would hear it. Then it stopped. Silence. I stayed still, waiting, listening for anything. A sound. A breath. But there was nothing. Just as I started to think maybe I imagined it, I heard something worse. A voice came from right outside the tent. Quiet at first, then clearer. It was my voice. It was saying my name. I froze. My brain couldn't make sense of it. It sounded just like me. Same tone, same way I say my own name. But it wasn't me. I was inside the tent. Then it spoke again. Not just my name this time. Full sentences. But wrong. The words were jumbled, like someone trying to imitate human speech but not getting it quite right. I reached for my rifle. My hands were shaking. The voice kept going, but now it was moving. Whatever was outside was circling the tent again, muttering words in my voice over and over. Some of them made sense. Some of them didn't. It sounded like gibberish. Then I heard something even worse. The zipper. The tent zipper started moving, just an inch. Just enough to make a sound. I snapped. I grabbed my rifle, sat up fast, and yanked the zipper down myself, throwing the flap open. The moon was out, barely enough light to see, and I saw it. It was standing just a few feet away. It looked like a person, but it wasn't. It was too tall, too thin. The way it stood, the way it moved, it wasn't right. His head tilted in this weird, unnatural way, like it didn't understand how to hold itself up. And its face looked like mine. Not exactly, not perfect, but close enough that my stomach turned. It was like someone had stretched a mask of my own skin over something else. Something that wasn't human. I raised the rifle. I didn't think. I just acted. The shot echoed through the trees. The thing jerked back, but it didn't fall. It didn't even bleed. It just turned its head to the side, like it was studying me. Then it moved. Fast. I barely had time to react before it was gone, vanishing into the trees. The moment it left, the woods went back to being silent. The air felt heavier, like whatever had been there took something with it. I didn't sleep. I didn't move. I sat there with my rifle, staring out into the dark until the sun came up. The first light, I packed my things. I didn't care about breakfast. I didn't care about anything except getting the hell out of there. I drove back to town without stopping, without looking back. I told myself I wouldn't go camping again, and I haven't. It's been years, but I still think about that night. I still hear that voice sometimes late at night when the house is quiet, saying my name. And every time I wonder, what if I had unzipped that tent just a little slower? What if I had waited one more second? Would I still be here? I was a cop for 12 years before I quit. I had seen a lot: drug busts gone wrong, high-speed chases, domestic calls that left me staring at the ceiling at night. But there's one thing that still sticks with me. something that happened on what was supposed to be a quiet weekend away from the job. It was 2016, and I was 38 years old. My partner and I had planned a 3-day camping trip deep in the woods of northern Michigan, away from the city noise and the constant pressure of work. We were both cops, but this wasn't an official thing, just two guys looking to clear their heads, breathe in some fresh air, and maybe fish a little. The place we picked was about 20 miles from any major roads, a quiet spot we had used a couple of times before. No cell service, no people, just trees, a lake, and the sound of wind moving through the pines. We packed light, just enough supplies to get us through the weekend, and drove out early on a Friday morning. The first day was peaceful. We set up camp, built a fire, and sat around drinking cheap beer while the sun dipped below the tree line. There was a sense of relief being out there, away from the stress of the job. Out in the woods, it was easy to forget the weight of everything we had seen over the years. I woke up early on the second morning, just as the first bit of sunlight started breaking through the trees. The air was cool, and the forest was silent except for the distant call of some bird I couldn't name. My partner was still asleep, so I decided to go for a short walk before breakfast. I didn't bring much with me, just my knife and a small flashlight in my pocket. The forest was thick, but I had a decent sense of direction. I walked maybe a mile from camp, moving through a mix of tall pines and low shrubs, feeling more at ease than I had in months. And then I smelled it. It was faint at first, just a hint of something sour on the air. At first, I figured it was an old animal carcass. That wasn't uncommon in the woods. Deer that had been taken down by predators, maybe even a bear's leftovers. But as I walked a little further, the smell got stronger. I should have turned back. I should have ignored it, let it be. But that part of my brain, the part that had been trained to investigate, to follow a lead, kicked in before I could stop it. A few more steps, and I saw something just beyond the trees. It was a body. The first thing I noticed was how out of place it looked. The way it was lying there, just beyond the tree line, almost as if someone had dropped it there and left. The second thing I noticed was the color of the skin, a sickly, pale gray, the kind of color that tells you the person's been dead for a while. I took a step closer, instinct kicking in, my mind already processing what I was seeing. Male, mid-30s, face bloated from decomposition, clothes dirty but mostly intact.
No shoes.
His hands were twisted up near his chest, fingers curled like he had been grasping at something in his final moments. There was no obvious sign of trauma. No gunshot wounds, no knife marks, no blood that I could see. But something was definitely wrong. I crouched down, careful not to touch anything. The smell was unbearable now, thick and sour, the kind of stench that settles in the back of your throat and stays there. Then I noticed his feet. The bottoms were torn up, shredded like he had been running barefoot through the forest for miles. The skin was raw in some places, completely gone in others, exposing flesh and tendon. Whatever had happened to him, he had been moving fast. Too fast to stop, too fast to care about what was beneath him. That was the moment my stomach started to turn. I stood up, took a step back, trying to piece together what I was looking at. The guy hadn't been here long, maybe a few days at most. Long enough to start decomposing, but not long enough to be completely unrecognizable. I needed to get back to camp. I needed to wake up my partner and figure out what the hell we were supposed to do next. The walk back felt longer than it should have. Every little sound made my nerves jump. Branches snapping, birds moving through the trees, my own breathing. The moment I reached the campsite, I woke my partner and told him everything. He could see from my face that I wasn't messing around. We weren't in uniform, didn't have a radio, and there was no cell service out here. That meant we had one option: hike back to the truck and drive until we could call it in. We packed up fast, neither of us saying much. The whole way back to the truck, my mind kept replaying what I had seen. His hands, his feet, that awful expression on his face. When we finally got a signal and called it in, the dispatcher asked us to stay put until local authorities arrived. It took nearly 2 hours for them to get there. By the time we led them back to the body, something had changed. The body was still there, still lying in the same position. But now there were tracks around it, fresh ones. Someone had been here while we were gone. The officers scanned the area, hands on their weapons, eyes darting through the trees. We all felt it, that heavy, gut-churning feeling that someone was watching us. They processed the scene, took photos, made notes. The coroner's team arrived not long after, loading the body onto a stretcher. One of the officers pulled us aside, his face unreadable. "There's something you need to see." He led us a few yards away to a patch of disturbed dirt. Footprints, bare ones, leading away from where the body had been. But here's what didn't make sense. There was only one set of fresh footprints, moving away from the body, like someone had stood up and walked off into the woods. The officer stared at me. "You said he was dead when you found him, right?" I nodded, my throat dry. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Then why do these prints only go one way?" None of us had an answer for that. They never did find out who the man was. No missing persons report matched his description. No fingerprints showed up in any database. It was like he had never existed. I think about him sometimes, about the way his feet were torn apart, the way his hands were curled up like he had been trying to hold on to something that wasn't there. I don't camp anymore. I don't go anywhere without cell service. And every now and then, I catch myself looking over my shoulder, scanning the trees, just in case. I was never the kind of person to get scared easily. I grew up in the countryside, surrounded by woods, open fields, and long, empty roads that stretched for miles. I spent most of my time outside, hunting, fishing, or camping alone. I had learned early on how to take care of myself in the wild, how to make a fire, how to navigate without a GPS, and how to keep myself safe from animals. But nothing could have prepared me for that night by the river. It was early autumn, just cool enough that the mosquitoes were gone, but not so cold that camping was uncomfortable. I had taken a few days off work and decided to head out into the woods for a solo camping trip. There was a spot I had visited a couple of times before, tucked away deep in a forested valley, right by a slow-moving river. It was a peaceful place, far from any roads or hiking trails. I had never seen another person there, which was exactly why I liked it. I parked my truck about a mile away from the spot and hiked in with my gear. The woods were quiet, aside from the occasional rustling of leaves as squirrels darted through the trees. The sky was overcast, casting a dull gray light over everything, but I didn't mind. I liked the quiet. It felt like the world had stopped, like I was the only person left alive. By the time I reached the river, it was late afternoon. I set up my tent on a small patch of dry ground, just a few feet from the water's edge. I gathered some firewood, built a small fire, and cooked a simple meal. The evening air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and burning wood. As the sun started to set, I sat by the fire and listened to the river. The water moved slow and steady, making a soft, constant noise that blended with the sounds of the forest. I felt completely at ease, like I always did in the woods. But then, something changed. It was subtle at first. The usual nighttime sounds, the chirping of crickets, the distant hooting of an owl, faded away. It wasn't immediate, but over the course of a few minutes, the forest around me grew silent. I didn't think much of it at first. Sometimes, when a predator is nearby, smaller animals will go quiet. I figured maybe a coyote or a bobcat was moving through the area. I reached for my rifle, which I had leaned against a tree a few feet away, and rested it on my lap. It was more of a habit than anything else. I had never had to use it for self-defense before, but it was always better to be safe than sorry. I sat there for a while, staring into the fire, listening to the silence. Then I heard it, a faint, deliberate sound, a twig snapping, not the random crack of a branch falling, but the distinct sound of something or someone stepping on it. I turned my head slowly, scanning the darkness beyond the fire's glow. The trees were thick, their trunks stretching up like dark pillars against the dim sky. I didn't see anything, but I felt something, that deep, gut-level feeling that I wasn't alone. I stayed completely still, my eyes fixed on the darkness. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, just as I started to convince myself that it was nothing, I heard another sound, a slow, dragging noise, like something being pulled through the leaves. My grip tightened on my rifle. I wasn't the kind of person to scare easily, but I knew when something wasn't right. I had spent too many nights in the woods to ignore my instincts. I stood up slowly, keeping my rifle close, and stepped away from the fire. I moved toward the edge of the trees, straining my eyes into the darkness. Then I saw it, a figure. It was just a shadow at first, barely visible between the trees. But as my eyes adjusted, I could make out the shape of a man standing completely still, just beyond the reach of the firelight. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there, watching me. A cold chill ran down my spine. I didn't say anything. I didn't ask who he was or what he was doing there. I just stood there, gripping my rifle, waiting. For a long time, he didn't move. And then, without a sound, he turned and walked back into the trees. I listened as his footsteps faded into the distance. Then, just as suddenly as it had disappeared, the normal sounds of the forest returned. The crickets, the owls, the rustling of leaves in the wind. I stood there for a long time, heart pounding, trying to process what had just happened. Eventually, I forced myself to sit back down by the fire. I kept my rifle in my lap and stayed awake for as long as I could, staring into the trees. By the time the fire started to die down, exhaustion began to take over. I knew I needed to sleep, but I didn't dare go inside my tent. Instead, I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag and sat with my back against a tree, facing the woods. I must have drifted off at some point because the next thing I knew, I was waking up to the sound of something moving outside my camp. I didn't move. I kept my breathing slow and steady, pretending to still be asleep. The sound was closer this time, soft footsteps moving through the leaves, circling my camp. I cracked one eye open and saw a shadow moving just beyond the dying embers of my fire. He had come back. He was standing there again, watching me. I gripped my rifle and slowly sat up. The moment I moved, the figure took a step backward into the darkness. Then another, and another, and then he was gone. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. As soon as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I packed up my gear and left. I didn't eat. I didn't even put out my fire properly. I just grabbed my things and started walking. The whole time, I felt like I was being watched. By the time I reached my truck, my hands were shaking. I threw my gear in the back, climbed into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. I didn't stop driving until I was home. I never went back to that spot. I never even told anyone what happened, because I knew what I saw, and I knew that if I had stayed one more night, I might not have made it out. I don't camp much anymore, not after that night. It was 2013, early autumn, and I had taken a trip out to the forest alone. I liked camping even though I wasn't the most experienced. I had gone a few times with friends before, but this was my first solo trip. I thought it would be peaceful, just me, the quiet, and the sound of rain against the leaves. The forest I chose was a few hours away from where I lived. I had found it online, a stretch of dense woods near an old logging road. Not a designated campsite, just wilderness. I liked the idea of being away from people, away from noise. I packed everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a flashlight, extra batteries, a knife, and a first aid kit. I had even checked the weather beforehand. Rain was expected, but nothing severe. I arrived late in the afternoon. The drive had been long, and the last few miles were nothing but muddy roads and thick trees. My car struggled a little as I got deeper into the woods, but eventually, I found a good spot. A clearing surrounded by tall pines, far enough from the road that I wouldn't see or hear another soul. The ground was damp from earlier rain, but nothing too bad. I set up my tent, unpacked my things, and gathered some firewood while there was still light. By the time the sun had started to set, I had a small fire going. I ate a sandwich, had some water, and sat by the flames, enjoying the quiet. The sound of distant thunder rumbled across the sky. The wind was picking up. The air smelled like wet earth and pine. I didn't mind the weather. I had always found the sound of rain calming. Then, as the light faded, I started feeling off. First, it was small things. The feeling of being watched. The way the trees seemed to press in closer. The firelight flickered against the trunks, casting long shadows that danced with the wind. I shook it off. Being alone in the woods could do that to your mind. Every little sound felt bigger. Every shadow seemed darker. I told myself it was just my nerves. The rain started lightly at first, just a few drops against the leaves. Then, within minutes, it became a steady downpour. I retreated into my tent, zipped myself inside, and listened as the rain hit the fabric above me. The sound was loud, constant, almost deafening. The fire outside had gone out instantly. I laid back, tried to get comfortable, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was around midnight when I heard it, a noise outside my tent. At first, I thought it was just the wind, maybe a branch snapping under the weight of the rain. But then I heard it again, a slow, deliberate movement, footsteps, heavy, careful, crunching against the wet forest floor. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. My heart started pounding. I reached for my flashlight, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to make a sound. The footsteps stopped. I listened, holding my breath. Nothing, just the rain. Then, another noise, closer this time. Something shifting, breathing. I forced myself to stay still. My mind was racing. A bear? A deer? But it didn't sound like an animal. It sounded deliberate, like someone was standing outside my tent, just waiting. I wanted to unzip the tent and look. I wanted to know what was out there, but something told me not to. Then, something pressed against the side of my tent. I felt it, just a slight push, barely enough to move the fabric. But it was real. Something was out there, and it knew I was inside. I gripped my knife, my hands shaking, and then it was gone. The pressure disappeared. The footsteps faded. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours, listening, waiting. The rain never let up, drowning out any other sounds. I didn't sleep. I just lay there, gripping my knife, heart pounding. At some point, exhaustion took over. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, the sky was getting lighter. The rain had slowed to a drizzle. I unzipped the tent carefully, my hands still shaking. The first thing I noticed was the footprints. Large, deep, not animal tracks. Someone had been there. Someone had stood outside my tent in the middle of the night. I scanned the tree line, my stomach in knots. Nothing. No sign of anyone. I packed up my things as fast as I could. I didn't eat, didn't stop to rest. I just stuffed everything into my bag and started back toward my car. The whole way, I felt like I was being watched. Every snap of a branch, every rustling leaf made my skin crawl. When I finally reached my car, My hands were shaking so badly I struggled to get the keys into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of there, mud spraying behind me. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on a real road, civilization in sight. I never reported it. What would I even say? That someone stood outside my tent all night, watching me? That I felt like I was being hunted? There was no proof, nothing to investigate. But I know what I felt. I haven't been camping since. I spent my whole life camping. Some of my best memories are of long weekends out in the wilderness, setting up a tent, making a fire, and sleeping under the open sky. I never thought much about safety beyond the usual precautions. Watch for bears, keep food secured, and don't wander too far alone. People always worried about the animals, but I learned the hard way that the most dangerous thing out there is people. This happened in 2015. I was 32 at the time, living in Idaho. I worked a job that took a lot out of me, so I spent my weekends getting as far away from everything as possible. I had a favorite spot out in the Sawtooth Mountains, about a 2-hour drive from Boise. It wasn't an official campground, just a clearing by a river I found years back. No trails led to it, so it was rare to see anyone out there. It was peaceful, untouched, exactly how I liked it. That weekend, I packed up my truck and left early Saturday morning. I had enough supplies to stay 2 nights, plenty of food, water, and my usual camping gear. I also brought my Ruger .357, a habit I picked up after a bear encounter a few years back. It wasn't often that I needed it, but it gave me peace of mind. By noon, I reached the rough dirt road that led to my camping spot. The drive was slow, too many rocks and deep ruts, but I eventually got to the clearing. Nothing had changed. The river still ran strong, and the tall pines swayed gently in the breeze. The only tracks in the dirt were my own. It was perfect. I spent the afternoon setting up my tent and gathering firewood. After dinner, I sat by the fire, listening to the sounds of the forest. Owls hooted, crickets chirped, and the river rushed over the rocks. It was exactly what I needed. At some point, I must have dozed off. I woke up to the fire burned low, just glowing embers. The forest was quiet now, almost too quiet. No wind, no insects, just silence. A strange feeling crept over me, an uneasy kind of stillness. I looked around but saw nothing unusual. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it across the trees. The beam caught something, a shape, deep in the woods just outside the firelight. It was gone in an instant, vanishing into the trees. My first thought was that it was an animal, but it didn't move like one. I stood up, listening hard. My own breath was too loud in my ears. I didn't hear anything, no footsteps, no rustling, just nothing. I told myself it was nothing, but I kept my gun close when I went into the tent. That night, I barely slept. Every small sound set me on edge. When I finally drifted off, it wasn't long before I woke up again. This time to the sound of crunching. Footsteps, not an animal. Slow, deliberate steps. My heart pounded as I reached for my gun. I lay still, listening. The steps circled my tent, stopping just outside. I held my breath, gripping the gun so tight my fingers ached. Whoever was out there stood just inches from where I lay, only a thin layer of nylon between us. Then silence. No footsteps, no breathing, just the sound of my own heartbeat hammering in my ears. I stayed like that for what felt like hours before exhaustion finally took over. When I woke, it was morning. Sunlight filtered through the tent, and everything seemed normal. For a moment, I convinced myself I had imagined it, that I let my nerves get the best of me. But then I stepped outside. There were footprints, clear, deep impressions in the dirt, circling my tent. They weren't mine. I followed them to the edge of the clearing, where they vanished into the woods. Whoever had been out there had watched me for a long time. I thought about packing up right then, but a stubborn part of me refused. I had never run from a camping trip before, and I didn't want to start now. I told myself it was just some hiker passing through, maybe a hunter checking the area. Still, I kept my gun on my belt as I went about my day. I spent most of it fishing, trying to push the night from my mind. By evening, I felt more at ease. But as the sun set, that feeling came back. The stillness, the unnatural quiet. I kept my fire bigger than usual that night, watching the trees, waiting for something to move. It didn't take long. Around midnight, I saw him, a figure just beyond the tree line, standing still, watching. He was tall, thin, wearing dark clothes. He didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there. I raised my gun and pointed it straight at him, hoping that would be enough to send him running. It wasn't. He stayed put, watching. I yelled, my voice sharp in the silence. Nothing. Not a single reaction. Then, slowly, he took a step forward. Then another. That was enough for me. I fired a shot into the air. The sound cracked through the trees, echoing through the valley. For a moment, he hesitated. Then, without a word, he turned and walked back into the woods. I didn't sleep. I sat with my gun in my lap, staring at the trees until the first light of dawn. The moment the sun was up, I packed my gear. As I threw the last bag into my truck, I looked back at the woods. He was there, standing at the same spot, watching. I didn't wait. I got into the truck and tore down that dirt road as fast as I could. I never went back to that spot. I never even told anyone what happened. But I know what I saw. Someone had been watching me. Someone had followed me. And the worst part, he wasn't afraid. I was never a big fan of camping, but my mom's friend, Lisa, had been talking about it for months. She loved the outdoors, always going on about how fresh air and nature did wonders for the soul. My mom couldn't make it, so she asked me to go instead. I wasn't thrilled about it, but I agreed. Lisa had picked a remote spot in northern Idaho, a quiet area with a large lake, dense forests, and barely any visitors. It was about a 4-hour drive from my place, most of it on paved roads, but the last hour was all dirt paths, winding through thick woods. The area wasn't a campground, no designated spots, no fire pits, no restrooms, just wilderness. She'd found it on some forum for outdoor enthusiasts, a hidden gem that hardly anyone knew about. The trip started off normal. I met up with Lisa early in the morning, loaded up our gear into her truck, and we headed out. The drive was uneventful until we got onto the dirt road leading to the camping spot. The trees grew so dense that they blocked out most of the sunlight, casting everything in a dull greenish haze. The path was rough, filled with potholes and deep tire ruts. Lisa had to drive slow, weaving around the worst spots. At one point, I noticed something off in the trees. It was just a shadow at first, something moving. I told myself it was an animal, but it felt like it was keeping pace with the truck. I kept watching, but whatever it was disappeared behind the thick tree trunks. I didn't say anything to Lisa. It was probably just my imagination. We finally reached the campsite, a small clearing near the lake, surrounded by towering pines. It was beautiful, quiet, and completely isolated. The only sounds were the wind in the trees and the occasional bird call. We set up camp, pitching our tents near the edge of the clearing. Lisa had brought a small fishing boat, and she suggested we take it out before dark. The lake was calm, its surface glassy and smooth. We spent a couple of hours fishing, chatting about random things. I was starting to relax, even enjoy myself. By the time we got back to shore, the sun was setting. We made a fire, cooked some food, and settled in for the night. That's when things started to feel off. As the fire crackled, I kept getting this weird feeling, like we were being watched. I told myself it was just nerves, being in an unfamiliar place so far from other people. But then Lisa mentioned it. "Feels kind of weird out here, doesn't it?" she said, poking at the fire with a stick. I nodded but didn't say much. The night felt too still. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just silence. We decided to turn in early. Lisa went to her tent, and I crawled into mine. The tent fabric did little to make me feel safe, but I forced myself to relax. I listened to the wind moving through the trees, focusing on the rhythmic sound. Then, sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. Took me a second to figure out why. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint glow over the campsite. The night was silent, almost unnaturally so. Then I heard it, a soft rustling just outside my tent. I held my breath, listening. The sound was light, like footsteps moving through grass. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer, but something felt wrong about it. It was too careful, too slow. Then the footsteps stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing. I strained to hear, but all I could pick up was the sound of my own breathing. Then I heard something worse. Breathing. It was close, just outside my tent. I stayed as still as possible, barely daring to breathe. The sound was shallow, deliberate, like someone trying not to be heard. I reached for my flashlight, moving slowly. My fingers closed around it and I flicked it on. The second the beam hit the tent fabric, the breathing stopped. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest. After a long minute, I unzipped the tent just a crack and shined the light outside. Nothing. The campsite was empty, just the dying embers of the fire glowing in the dark. I scanned the trees, but all I saw was blackness. No movement, no signs of anything unusual. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, listening. I didn't hear anything else, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there. In the morning, Lisa noticed something odd. "There's footprints here," she said, pointing near my tent. I crouched down, my stomach twisting. The prints were deep, human-shaped. They led from the trees, circled my tent, then disappeared back into the woods. Lisa tried to brush it off, maybe a hiker passing through, but we both knew that made no sense. No one should have been out there. We packed up early. Neither of us said much, but we both felt it. The unease, the sense that we weren't alone. The drive back was quiet. The whole way, I kept looking out the window, half expecting to see something moving in the trees. I never did, but even now I still think about it, and I still wonder who or what was out there that night. I never planned on camping in a graveyard. It wasn't some thrill-seeking adventure or a dare from a friend. It was just the most secluded place I could find that night. I was driving through a quiet stretch of back roads in Pennsylvania, heading toward the Appalachian Mountains, trying to put some distance between me and the life I had left behind. I had been on the road for a couple of days, stopping at small gas stations and sleeping in the back of my truck when I needed rest. I had a tent, a sleeping bag, and a few supplies, but I didn't want to stay at a campground or anywhere too close to people. I needed to be alone. That evening, as the sun was dipping below the hills, I passed by an old, overgrown cemetery. There was no sign, no fence, just a small dirt path leading into the woods. The gravestones were scattered, some leaning, some half sunken into the ground. The place looked long forgotten. No flowers, no fresh soil, just stones, moss, and silence. I pulled over, turned off my truck, and stepped outside. The air was damp and thick with the scent of earth and pine. The sound of birds faded as the last bit of daylight slipped away. It was perfect, secluded, quiet, away from everything. I grabbed my pack, set up my tent in a small clearing between the graves, and unrolled my sleeping bag. The ground was uneven, soft in some places, too firm in others. I tried not to think too much about what was beneath me. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves and making the old branches creak. I built a small fire, not too big, just enough for some warmth and light. The flames flickered, casting long shadows across the graves. I sat on the ground, eating a protein bar and staring into the fire, letting my thoughts drift. I didn't believe in ghosts. The dead were dead. What haunted people were the living, the memories, the mistakes they couldn't escape. I had my fair share of those. As the night stretched on, the fire died down, leaving behind glowing embers. I zipped up my jacket and leaned back against my pack, listening to the wind. Somewhere in the distance, an animal moved through the underbrush. Maybe a deer, maybe something else. I didn't care. I was about to turn in when I noticed something. The woods had gone quiet. No wind, no rustling leaves, no distant night sounds. Just stillness. I held my breath, listening. Then, footsteps. Slow, measured. Not an animal. Too deliberate. I turned my head toward the darkness beyond the graves, my heart picking up speed. The fire's dim glow barely reached past the nearest headstones, but I could see just enough. Something moved, a shape, just beyond the fire's reach. Standing still, watching, my chest tightened. I told myself it was a trick of the light, my mind playing games. But then it moved again, closer. I reached for my knife, gripping the handle tight. The shape was a man. He was standing just a few feet away, partially hidden behind an old, crumbling headstone. I could see his silhouette, the way his head tilted slightly, like he was studying me. I didn't say anything. I didn't move. Then, just as slowly as he had appeared, he stepped back into the darkness and disappeared. I sat there for a long time, gripping my knife, my breath shallow. I listened for more movement, for any sign that he was still there. But there was nothing. I wasn't about to sit out in the open any longer. I moved quickly, throwing dirt over the fire and grabbing my pack. I didn't bother taking down the tent. I just grabbed what I needed and headed for my truck. The moment I reached the driver's seat, I locked the doors and started the engine. The headlights flashed across the graveyard, illuminating the crooked stones and tangled undergrowth. But no one was there. I didn't sleep that night. I just drove, putting as much distance between me and that place as possible. I don't know who he was. I don't know what he wanted, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. And I never camped alone again. I always liked being outdoors. Camping was something I grew up with, something that felt normal. I never thought much about the dangers of it. If you're careful, if you know what you're doing, it's just you and the quiet of the woods. That's what I thought. Anyway, this happened in 2017. I was 28. I had some time off work, and I wanted to clear my head. I lived in Ohio at the time and had always camped in state parks, but I wanted something different. I found a remote spot in West Virginia, deep in the Monongahela National Forest, where I could be alone for a few days. No cell service, no crowds, just me and the woods. I packed up my truck with everything I needed. Tent, sleeping bag, cooler with enough food for 3 nights, and my hunting rifle, not for sport but in case of animals. The drive took about 5 hours. The last hour was all rough forest roads, barely maintained, cutting through thick trees and hills. By the time I reached my spot, it was late afternoon. The place was perfect, completely isolated, with a small clearing and a creek running nearby. I set up camp quickly, pitched my tent, started a fire, and cooked a simple meal. The quiet out there was different than in a campground. No distant voices, no cars, just the rustling of trees and the occasional snap of a branch. That first night, nothing happened. I fell asleep easily, listening to the wind. The second day, I went exploring. I followed the creek for a while, keeping track of my location with a GPS watch. After a couple of hours, I started feeling like I was being watched. It wasn't anything obvious, no sounds, no movement, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I kept going for a bit, but then saw something that made me stop. In a small clearing, there was an old fire pit, long abandoned. Around it, there were bones. Not big ones, small, maybe from a rabbit or something, but there were a lot of them. Some looked like they had been chewed on, cracked open. It wasn't that unusual. Animals do that. But something about the way they were scattered felt wrong. Like they had been placed there, not just left behind naturally. I turned back, deciding to stick closer to my campsite. That night, I felt uneasy. The forest was too quiet. No crickets, no owls, nothing. I've camped enough to know that silence like that isn't normal. I barely slept. Every little noise made me sit up, listening. At one point, I heard a soft snapping sound, like something stepping on a twig. But when I shone my flashlight outside the tent, there was nothing. The next day, I wanted to leave, but something stopped me. Maybe pride, maybe stupidity. I told myself I was overreacting, that I had 3 nights planned, and I wasn't going to let my own imagination ruin it. I spent most of the day close to camp, gathering firewood and keeping busy. Around late afternoon, I went back to the creek to fill up my water bottles. That's when I saw it. Footprints. Not mine. They were fresh, pressed into the soft mud near the water. They weren't boot prints either. Barefoot. I felt my stomach drop. I wasn't alone out here. I forced myself to stay calm. The prints led away from the creek into the trees. I stood there for a long time, staring at them, my brain trying to come up with a normal explanation. Maybe some hiker had passed through, but who hikes barefoot in the middle of nowhere? I walked back to camp, rifle in hand. I wanted to leave, but it would be dark soon. Driving those forest roads at night wasn't a good idea. I decided I'd stay one more night, but I wouldn't sleep. That night, I kept the fire going, sitting with my back against my truck. Every so often, I'd shine my flashlight into the trees, but I never saw anything. The night dragged on, the darkness feeling heavier than before. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it. A whistle. A single, sharp whistle from deep in the woods. I froze. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. It was a person. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. Then, a second whistle. Closer. I picked up my rifle, chambered around, and scanned the trees. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel something watching me. Then I heard the sound of movement. Slow, deliberate footsteps, just beyond the firelight. I wasn't going to wait. I grabbed my keys, jumped into my truck, and started the engine. The headlights lit up the trees, but there was nothing there. I threw my gear into the bed as fast as I could and sped off, not caring about the rough road. As I drove, I kept checking the mirror, expecting to see something behind me. I didn't stop until I was back on a paved road, miles from that place. I never went back. I don't know who or what was out there, but I know this. Someone was watching me. Someone wanted me to know they were there, and they waited until the last night to let me know. I've camped since then, but never alone. The last time I had been in the field, I had sworn to myself it would be the final time. I had done my share, more than my share. I had spent 20 years in operations that most people wouldn't even believe happened. I had walked through places no man should ever walk, seen things no man should ever see. When I finally left, I told myself I'd never go back to anything like it. That was years ago. Now I was retired, living a quiet life in the countryside. No more missions, no more tension in my shoulders every time I stepped outside. No more carrying a weapon unless it was for hunting. That's what I told myself, at least. I had taken up camping again. It was something I used to do when I was younger, before my career took over my life. I liked the solitude, the quiet of nature. No people, no orders, no threats. Just me, a tent, and the wilderness. This time, I had driven out to a remote area of a national forest. No marked campsites, no official trails, just a vast stretch of land where I could be alone. I had picked a spot miles away from the nearest road, set up camp by a small creek, and planned to stay for a few days. It was supposed to be relaxing. The first night was peaceful. I sat by the fire, listened to the sounds of the woods, and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, at ease. I wasn't looking over my shoulder. I wasn't thinking about worst-case scenarios. That changed on the second night. I had been sleeping lightly like always. Old habits don't die easy. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up. No reason at first, just that sense you get when something is off. I stayed still, listening. The fire had burned down to embers, and the woods were quiet. Too quiet. Then I heard it. A rustling, slow and deliberate, somewhere beyond the trees. Not an animal. An animal moves with uncertainty, starts and stops. This was steady, careful. Someone was out there. I stayed completely still. Whoever it was, they didn't have a light. That meant one of two things. They had night vision, or they knew the area well enough to move through it in the dark. Neither option was good. I reached slowly for the knife I kept by my sleeping bag. I didn't move otherwise. I controlled my breathing, listening. The steps came closer. Then they stopped. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears. I waited. Minutes passed. Then more. Nothing. Eventually, I heard the steps retreat, fading into the woods. I stayed awake until dawn. By morning, I told myself it had been nothing. Maybe another camper passing through. Maybe my imagination getting the better of me. But I didn't believe it. I checked the perimeter of my camp. The ground was soft from the recent rain, and I found the tracks easily.
Bootprints.
Not hiking boots, tactical. The kind I used to wear. That was when I knew. I wasn't alone out here, and whoever was out there wasn't just some lost hiker. I had been found. I packed my gear carefully, taking my time, making sure I left nothing behind. I didn't know who was out there, but I knew how these things worked. If they wanted me dead, I wouldn't have woken up at all. This wasn't an attack. It was observation. Someone was watching me. I had left that life behind, but it hadn't left me. I considered my options. Getting back to my truck would take half a day if I moved fast, but that was the problem. If I had been tracked here, they knew where my vehicle was. They could be waiting. I could go deeper into the woods, try to outlast them, but that was a gamble. I decided on something else, something they wouldn't expect. I set a trap. I moved a few hundred yards away from my camp, found a good vantage point, and waited. I had no rifle, no sidearm, just my knife and an old hunting bow I had brought for fun. It would have to do. Hours passed. Then I saw him, a man moving through my camp, alone, dressed like a hunter, but I knew better. He was looking for something. He was looking for me. I could have taken him right then, could have ended it, but I needed answers. I moved fast and quiet, staying downwind. When I got close enough, I stepped on a branch deliberately. His head snapped up. He reached for his belt, knife, not a gun. That told me something. I moved before he could react. A quick strike, nothing lethal. I needed him alive. He hit the ground hard. I didn't speak. He didn't either. Just looked at me, breathing heavy. I saw the recognition in his eyes. He knew who I was. I took what I needed from him, maps, a radio, a notebook. Then I left him there. He wouldn't die, but he wouldn't be coming after me again either. I moved fast after that, covering my tracks. I reached my truck before dark. Nothing had been touched. That meant one of two things: either he was alone, or the others were waiting further down the road. I took the long way out, miles of back roads, no stops. I didn't go home. That was a year ago. I don't camp anymore. Whoever he was, whatever he wanted, I never found out. But I knew one thing: someone had come looking for me. And that meant someday someone else would come too.